Hey, historians, it is review time. This is a review for modules 12 through, no, 10, 11, and 12 from the National Constitution Center. This deals with freedom of speech, the Fourth Amendment, and slavery in the Constitution. So we're going to start with freedom of speech. Remember, this is just a review. If you're questionable on anything, there are videos that our lovely friend Jeffrey Rosen speaks in, where he goes and covers this in much more detail. All right. But we learned that freedom of speech is one of the five freedoms that is laid out in the First Amendment. And the interpretation of free speech and how broad or constricted it is has changed a bit over time. And our friend Jeffrey Rosen goes over some of the reasons why freedom of speech is so important. Because us as citizens being able to speak freely, it holds our representatives in government. So therefore, it really is a product of self-government and a government by the people. Freedom of speech helps us discover the truth, and it also helps us to reject falsehood as those are exposed. All right, so over time, the Supreme Court has really expanded our right to free speech. It includes symbolic speech. It includes things that we might not agree with or we might find offensive or uncomfortable. But as long as it isn't intended to and likely to cause violence. So you need to have that gun pointed to your head with the finger on the trigger, so to speak. Just because it is violent speech or threatening speech, unless it's about to cause imminent violence, it is not restricted. Um, Remember, we went over the speech, or the writing, I should say, of Justice Brandeis, that in order for self-government to succeed, we need more speech, not enforced silence, right? Because with silence, we'll never really get to the truth of things. So remember that that is just one of the freedoms in the First Amendment. The First Amendment covers religion, right? So both the establishment clause of religion and the exercise clause, meaning the government can't enforce what religion you believe in, nor can it restrict your practices of your religion within reason. For freedom of speech, the press, to assemble and petition the government. And remember, when this was originally written, right, as the First Amendment to the Constitution, this was saying that the federal government could not violate these. That's why it says Congress shall make no law. And then it was the 14th Amendment that really said, well, the states or local governments can't make laws that violate this either. A little bit more on free speech. SCOTUS rulings have changed or enforced even the way we look at free speech. Some of that has changed over time because the way we communicate has changed since the days of the Constitution. Right now, we also communicate with things like cell phones and the internet. Right, forget even just TV and radio that wasn't around back then. And a big court case from 2014 was Riley versus California. Right, can the government monitor your cell phone usage? Can it listen? Can it track you with a GPS? And this has to consider the Fourth Amendment when figuring this out, because the Fourth Amendment deals with warrants, right? So a warrant needs to describe the place to be searched and also what items are to be seized. So this said that there can't be like this warrant that there can't be permission to just, for an unlimited amount of time to track someone's cell phone, right? A warrant would be needed. You don't always know the warrant is given when it's through digital, but the warrant still needs to be relayed to the judge for exactly why it needs to be monitored, for what time, and so forth. Right? And this also incorporates the third party doctrine. And this is something really important to realize whenever you sign on a dotted line, right? Whenever you agree to terms of service, that a third party doctrine says there's no expectation in privacy and information voluntarily provided to others. So if you have that smartphone, that smart TV, your Alexa, you're Googling things, and you know they're acquiring that information and you allow them to, you then can't expect it to all be private, right? The Fourth Amendment protects the right to be secure in your person, your house, your papers, your effects, against unreasonable search and seizures. But if you're voluntarily providing information, you can't expect privacy anymore with that. Here's another case related to this. This is Olmsted versus the US. This was much earlier. This dealt with Roy Olmsted, who was a bootlegger. And in a 5-4 decision, and we discussed in 5-4 decisions, those are close, that shows, could they be overturned someday, right? SCOTUS ruled that the government's use of wiretaps had not violated the Fourth Amendment. So before you had Riley versus California, you had Olmsted already looking at wiretapping. All right, so for the court majority, a Fourth Amendment violation required an actual physical examination, right? So well, if it's like something over the wires, does that still need a warrant the way a physical thing does, right? So that brings us to this one, Katz versus the United States in 1967. This dealt with illegal things going on and gambling and stuff, but the man was letting out the information so that he couldn't be wiretapped by going to a telephone booth. You might not see them much anymore. They do exist. They existed much more in the past. So, a machine, you put in the quarters, you make your call. And they said, well, how can he expect privacy when in the first place it's made of glass and you can see into it? Something to really keep in mind, since you may attend the Passaic County School of Glass here. Can we expect any privacy? Right? But anyway, dealing with the phone and recording the phone line. And they said he cannot expect privacy when he's going into a phone on this phone booth, because the Fourth Amendment protects people. It doesn't protect places. It doesn't protect the phone booth from not being seen or heard. There's more cases that won't be covered on this test, but we can always talk about it the last few days. Using heat sensory technology to see who's growing marijuana in apartments, right? That made it to the Supreme Court. That they said that was unconstitutional. But think the way these technologies have changed the way we look at the freedom of speech, the way we look at the Fourth Amendment, right? You've heard that anything you put on your cell phone, is and send out is not really private. Well, there still needs to be warrants for certain information, but those warrants are obtainable. Think of your GPS monitoring, all that sort of stuff. And here is a result from Carpenter versus the U.S., which was another 5-4, right? It shows you how divided this issue is from just a few years ago, 2018. And Justice Neil Gorsuch, in his dissent, right, wrote something that you should think of here. What's left of the Fourth Amendment? Today, we use the internet to do most everything. Smartphones make it easier to keep a calendar, correspond with friends, make calls, conduct banking, and even watch the game. Countless internet companies maintain records about us, and increasingly for us, even our most private documents. Those that in other eras would have been locked safely in a desk drawer or destroyed now reside on third-party servers. So with the third-party doctrine, in other words, is anything really private anymore? So keep in mind what you are willing to put out there, right? Something to think about. You've grown up with it, right? But something you still need to reflect on. A little bit more on the Fourth Amendment, which you see above here. The key word here is unreasonable, right? Against an unreasonable search and seizure. So what would a common person consider to be reasonable or unreasonable? Brandeis, who we learned a lot about, he called this basically the left alone amendment. And a lot of the right to privacy comes out of the Fourth Amendment, also other amendments, Ninth and so forth. But the idea that people have the right just to be left alone, right? That's important. It also includes the exclusionary rule, that evidence has to be thrown out that violates the Fourth Amendment. So if you obtain information illegally without a warrant or the wrong way, that information can't be used against you in court. And we've discussed this year how most of our First Amendments have its roots in things we were protesting against in the Revolutionary War. And this is where comes the writs of assistance, if you remember we learned about during the time of Revolution, where the British were searching for smuggled goods, when they were bringing in Dutch goods that weren't allowed or whatever. They were going in people's homes and shops trying to find that. And James Otis, a lawyer from Boston, argued against this, and he argued against arbitrary searches, right? You can't just come searching a house because you think it might be here. Let's have some evidence. And John Adams, who was our revolutionary mind and later became our second president, says right then and there, the child of independence was born. So it was almost that right to your personal belongings, right? And your privacy that did really inspire the revolution. And some of these cases have been controversial, right? When it comes to right of free speech and things like that. So let's look at Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969. And the interpretation of some of this has changed with different things about hate speech and hate crimes that have come since. And is deplorable as the KKK was, right? Um, the court ruled that it still protected speech unless they're about to cause immediate harm, right? So if they're like, you can tell that they're saying something and they're about to harm people or kill people, or then it violates it. But just proclaiming things as deplorable and offensive as it is, unfortunately or unfortunately, doesn't violate the right to free speech. And this was a unanimous decision, by the way. Um, and it's a good one to really discuss and think about. Another example of symbolic speech, we have this from the 1960s, Tinker v. Des Moines. This concerned high school students, like many of you, and students protesting the Vietnam War wearing the black armbands, which is symbolic speech. So they weren't vocally saying anything, but it was still expressing their opinions, expressing their freedom of conscience. They were protesting the Vietnam War, and they were in trouble at school. They made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court defended them. Now, rights of students, what it has the Supreme Court, has sort of changed over time. It hasn't been as liberal, I guess, if you will, as it was at this point. But to still know that, your rights don't stop at the schoolhouse gates was the famous line regarding this. And Tinker is still around. She still speaks about all this today. The courts are less likely to uphold low value speech. In other words, they're not really concerned about it. So you're not going to have a lot of constitutional protection for defamation, which you can get in trouble with, for threats you can get in trouble with, or just fighting words, which is known. Hey, Shuttershock. So it doesn't mean it's always illegal, which it may be. But there's not as much value to protect that kind of speech as there is other sorts of speech. Another court case is Schenck v. the U.S. in 1919, think World War I. Look up the case if you need to remind yourself of it, about distributing pamphlets opposing the draft. And this is where you get that yelling fire in a theater line, right? So as much as you have to right to free speech, if you falsely cause a panic and it's going to do harm to people, then that right no longer exists. Let's look real quickly at freedom of religion, that there's an establishment clause, right? No law respecting an establishment or religion. That means there can't be an official religion in our country, or now also by states. And they can't really make things that sort of favor one religion. That's been a town was defended in the Supreme Court that it could have a manger on display, for example, but there can't be an official enforcement of religion. That is why school prayer was struck down when after a case in New York happened years ago. But then there's also the exercise clause. And the exercise clause is why the Supreme Court last year permitted a football coach from kneeling and saying prayers after the game on the field, because he has the right to exercise his religion, right? So you see the two different parts. Religious laws, religious freedoms in the United States, you can look at its origins, and the first one to really hit the book, so to speak, was in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was really proud of himself for coming up with this. Their ideas weren't all originally his, right? But first to make it in a law. And Jefferson wrote that the opinions and, that should say beliefs, of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed in their minds. Meaning you can't even control. If you try to say, hey, you have to believe this religion or anything, you can't force someone, right? We have this natural freedom of conscience, and you can't really do anything to change that. Right. And lastly, let's look at slavery. Now, you want to look on my YouTube channel, I have a video that goes over in detail all the different ways that slavery was discussed in the Constitution. So if you're unclear, it mentions all the people and all the different arguments. Go ahead and look that up. I can link it if you wish. But remember, you have the debate: was slavery upheld in the Constitution, like Garrison believed, or you have Frederick Douglass pictured here, who said, no, this is a glorious liberty document. The Constitution really shows how slavery is not protected or really comes in lines with the principles of our country at all. How was slavery mentioned at the Constitutional Convention? Well, we have the Three-Fifths Compromise, which dealt with representation in government. Not that a slave is considered three-fifths of a person, though it can be interpreted that way, but three-fifths of slaves will be represented for political purposes, like how many representatives will they have in the House, so to speak. It also had the agreement that within 20 years, the international slave trade would end, which didn't mean slaves couldn't still be bought and sold in the United States, unfortunately. Didn't mean slavery would end in the United States, unfortunately. But we would no longer be importing, all right, as awkward it is to say, slaves in 20 years, which bring it to, I believe, 1808. And it's important to look at people who, for years, are bringing up this momentum, all right? Prince Hall, go back, right, to the early American Republic, and he was a freed black man in Massachusetts who petitioned the Massachusetts legislature. And even though slavery wasn't huge in states like Massachusetts, it did still exist, right? And it wasn't a slavery economy, but there were slaves. And he said slavery violates the principles of the Revolution. The same thing that Douglas later said, that Lincoln later said, that Jefferson acknowledged in his initial draft of the Declaration. And you know what? Massachusetts outlawed slavery, right? His speech wasn't the only reason, but this petition made a big difference because they're like, you're right, right? And we have some court cases, right? This is one of the court cases that we are not fond of, where the court really made several mistakes with here. And one being that the court, Taney's court, decided that Dred Scott cannot sue because as a black man, he had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. He cannot be considered a citizen, and he can't even sue in court. And the other awful part of the Dred Scott decision was that it sort of said, and the Missouri Compromise made no sense. Congress has no role in deciding in slavery or not, should it exist or not, and in what state. That's more up for the states to decide, according to the Taney decision. We mentioned Douglas looking at the Constitution as this liberty document. And we discussed in class why the second founding is often considered the period of Reconstruction, because it takes many of those ideals from the founding and then actually puts them in writing in our Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which does several things, but include bringing down many of those First Amendment rights that must be protected by the states, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave men, and this time meaning black men, the right to vote. Remember, women did not get a lot of these rights then until much later in 1920, when they had the right to vote as well. All right, so I went over a lot of things. Remember, any of these things that you write, you can be used. We'll go over some more before we take the test. Look at the modules, look at the videos for the Constitution Center, and any questions, let me know. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. All right, see you guys soon.